21st, 1947, and on official OTO business, and signed Baphomet 11th degree. It's also signed Baphomet 33 degrees, 90 degrees, 97 degree, which is another way of saying Baphomet, i.e. Crowley, head of the OTO, head of the Rite of Memphis, head of the Rite of Mitzrayim, which he claimed repeatedly to the very end of his life. So you will hear from some folks out there that some of considerable eminence that the OTO long ago discarded its Masonic pretensions, and that simply is not true. It claimed until very modern times, well after I got involved, in fact 20 some odd years ago, that it was a Masonic organization teaching a Masonic system, only with this wrinkle that it also taught the central gnosis of magic as part of its uppermost degrees, and perhaps introduced that in subtle ways through various rituals, including its central public ritual, the Gnostic Mass, which it indeed does if you know where to look. I think that kind of brings it up to the modern era. Crowley takes the helm. Some dispute exactly was given, doesn't matter. Took the helm in the early 1920s. And from that point until the 1970s, the OTO essentially, although a small organization, worked in that method. In Switzerland, they continued to work their Rites of Memphis and Mitzrayim degrees, but to accept the Book of the Law and to communicate the central gnosis of sexual magic. Elsewhere in the world of the MMM, that is where Crowley had the most influence, and here it became a 9-degree system, essentially, that most of which Crowley wrote himself, and which incorporated ideas from the earlier organizations, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light, the Asiatic Brethren, the Freighters Lucas, the Brothers of Light, and so forth, but which also included his wrinkle on Book of the Law and Central Secret. So you had all those things incorporated into it. Then we come to the modern era, we find certain modifications taking place under the first modern Grand Master, Grady McMurtry, and there have been additional modifications of a sort, some noticeable and some not, mostly of an administrative nature rather than a ritual nature, coming right up to the end of the 20th century, which is where I will leave this off and open it up for any questions that anyone has. How many of you have I lost? How many of you out there have I lost? Okay, thank you.
No, you haven't lost. I had a question. From an American history standpoint, it seems, it's a predominantly Christian, European countries, Britain, and where the OTO was actually founded. Is it less of a Christian-oriented view on, like only on Kabbalah and on things such as, is it more of an openness to the magical ideas versus the common everyday Christian perspective of?
It's gone back and forth, and it's depended a lot on the political climate in the external world. First of all, the authentic tradition from around the middle of the 19th century on, in America anyway, it begins to become a Judeo-Christian value. There are as many Jewish influences as Christian influences in it. And there's also a certain ethical monotheistic influence, particularly in Masonry. At one time in America was every third man. What it was not was integrated by sex, or integrated by race, and it still, indeed, to a large extent, is not integrated by race. And I have a serious problem with regular Freemasonry over that. Both of those issues. Women are not admitted, and there's a major dispute as to whether black Masons are legitimate Masons or not, and whether they're welcome. In southern jurisdiction, regular Freemasonry, in general, black people are still not admitted, and southern jurisdiction is the vast majority of Freemasons.
Wow.
And there are those who would dispute that, but trust me, I come from a long line of Masons, and that is the case. And it's one of the few organizations that still gets away with it. I'm totally opposed to that. The OTO, in fact, one of its first major differences with Orthodox Freemasonry, and by the way, which was preceded by the Brotherhood of Euless in the 19th century. If you're teaching the secret of sexual magic, unless it's a peculiarly homosexual magic, it's sort of, what do you do with it? You know? Do you take it home and share it with your spouse? Not if it's something that's learned under seal of initiation. No, they began to... The early OTO was virtually all male. There are some interesting pictures of the Royce-era leaders of the OTO, and there's not a single female in it, nor, I must say, a single non-Christian, non-white, well, it was a bunch of Germans. And in the Crowley era, you start to get women, because women were a necessity to... Well, women were a necessity to Crowley, actually, but women were also a necessity to the organization, in his opinion. And that was at the same time that the Theosophical Society was pushing co-Masonry, which encouraged... They were hoping to actually become Freemasonry and to replace... race was not even an issue that was brought up in those days, but gender was, and there was a move to allow women in. But it was not essential, except perhaps from an ethical point of view, for there to be no gender bias in co-Masonry. It was a matter of ethics, not a matter of necessity. In the OTO, I would say it was a matter of necessity and was seen as such, if not by Royce, and probably not. He was a creature of the Victorian era, by Crowley, who had an agenda of his own, and clearly very quickly elevated, I think, more women to the highest degrees in the OTO than men, in fact. And although the OTO was very, I think most people today don't realize how small it was in Crowley's lifetime. The fact is, the membership was predominantly female. Not the leadership, but the membership. And that carried over very quickly to the modern era. I don't know, did I stray from your question there a little bit?
I mean that's definitely interesting, and it's along the lines of what I was,
essentially, you can't really thread out, except from accuracy or inaccuracy. After the mid-1800s, what would have been easily distinguishable in Jewish magic and non-Jewish magic, or Jewish and Christian magic, because there was a definite fusion. Because Freemasonry, even the most conservative Freemasonry in America, was open to Jews and Gentiles. In fact, you see organizations, Catholic organizations like the Knights of Columbus, and especially the Knights of Columbus, desperately not wanting people to become part of a quasi-spiritual, maybe religious, secretive body that was not Catholic. So the Knights of Columbus was formed sort of along Masonic lines, but specifically for Catholics. The Jews formed B'nai B'rith in America, because every third Jewish male was a Mason. And that wasn't a huge group of people in those days, but that was roughly 1 million people out of the maybe 3 million Masons at that It had its impact, but what you do see in the more magical perspective is you can distinguish between those features that really know their stuff in terms of ancient cultures, ancient magic, and so forth, and those that clearly are mispronouncing words and keywords and signs and certain things that clearly they've learned from the King James Bible rather than from more ancient sources that are more comfortable with Hebraic tradition, terminology, and language and culture. The two are pretty fused from that point on. By the time the OTO had come along, although Germany in the 1890s was beginning to look like Germany 50 years later, which was not a particularly convivial place for Jews and Gentiles to get together. Nevertheless, you do see, in principle, an openness to everyone belonging. In fact, since it's an archaic ritual, I can mention it. The original Minerval degree in the OTO, which is still extant, if anyone would care to look at it, specifically calls for a black person to participate in the ritual. Now, that may sound like from the point of view of our time, deprecating, because it calls for a black janitor. Of course, from the standpoint of the 1890s or the early 1900s, when that ritual was written, to simply have a black person in lodge was stepping way out of line. In the South, where I'm from, that would have been illegal. To have a black janitor would be okay, but not a ritual black janitor. And in fact, there is a certain office in the current Minerval degree, which I can't mention specifically, which is descended from that role. It doesn't involve race, but the term is preserved.
So like the earlier OTO was more like a gentry class, more like a business type person, or a kind of a
To this day in Britain, each Masonic organization has some person of a royal. Essentially, a royal has to be the head, the nominal head of the particular order. That's just the way that it is. But again, there was that opening to the middle class. And by the time it reached America, I mean, there was certainly a lack of popularity for royals. There's a lot of royalist stuff in the OTO that has survived. I often criticize the fact that people take titles like Supreme and Most Holy King literally. And the first time I was at a convention, and certain persons who are of sufficient level of initiation, they should know better, start shouting, "Hail to the King, hail to the King." And I look at my old buddy sitting over there, looking slightly embarrassed and figuring, what is he going to do about this? And we had a chat about that, and I don't think we'll be seeing that anymore. We don't have kings here in America. It doesn't resonate real well. I think we had a revolution or something about kings. But as Masonic titles like Knight, which is common in Freemasonry, Prince, Princess, Dame, all of those are used. Some of them fairly extravagant, and even more extravagant than some of the traditional titles in Freemasonry. They aren't taken too literally in Freemasonry, and they probably should not be taken too seriously in the OTO either. I mean, a second degree is a second degree.
Well, I hope everybody has found the lecture from Bishop Greenfield to be informative. And again, I want to encourage everybody to look for his book, The Roots of Magick. I do not think that it is out yet, but it should be coming out soon, and I'll have a link to the press website on the Thelema Coast to Coast website. So, since we have reached the end of another podcast, I want to again remind everybody that Latex Records is giving a bunch of CDs away on the show, and the CD closing out this show is called Electro Age 1, The Awakening. This is a compilation CD with 15 songs. That was the first compilation, actually the first CD put together by Latex Records, and it has a number of different electronic and industrial bands. The outgoing song for today is called Under the Moon by a group called KAJ.